We're heading into the fourth winter of war in Ukraine, and energy is a key battleground. Each side is ramping up attacks on each other's energy infrastructure, and international restrictions on Russia's oil and gas sector have been significantly boosted by President Trump. He's imposing sanctions on Russia's two biggest oil companies to try and pressure Vladimir Putin into accepting a ceasefire. President Putin says that US and Western sanctions are an unfriendly act, but they won't significantly affect the country's economy. So what impact is all this having on Russia's economy and the global energy sector? Let's try and find out. I'm Carmel Crimmins, and this is Reuters Econ World. Every week, we go deep on the economic principles and ideas driving the biggest news around the world. This week's show, the energy war. So to get into the Russian economy and the global energy market, I spoke to two men who are in the thick of it. Dmitry Zhdannikov is our energy and commodities editor for Europe, the Middle East and Africa. And Guy Faulconbridge is our Russia bureau chief. Dmitry in the London studio and Guy in a busy Moscow newsroom. Hello.
Hello, Carmel.
Hi.
How are you?
Very well. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
The war in Ukraine has, first and foremost, had a terrible human cost. Thousands of lives lost and millions altered forever. It's also had, because of the two countries involved, major economic consequences at home and abroad. Has it fundamentally altered the energy sector, Dmitry?
Oh, it has dramatically changed the energy sector across the world. I mean, to begin with, Europe has completely abandoned Russian oil and gas purchases. That was already huge. I mean, Russia at some point was supplying over 50% of European gas needs, and oil was representing probably a third of supplies in Europe. So, yeah, I mean, Europe had to find new sources of supply elsewhere, and it became mainly the United States as a backup supplier, which really rescued Europe from a very deep gas crisis during the winter of 22 and 23. And Russia had to divert immense supplies towards Asia, towards China, and especially India, which prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine wasn't buying much of Russian energy at all.
Guy, energy has always been a central part of this conflict, hasn't it? In terms of it's a major driver of the Russian economy, but also it's been a target of sanctions. And we've also seen, particularly increasingly in the last few months, an increase in attacks on both sides on energy sites. Do you think as the war progresses, it's become even more of an energy war?
To an extent, it has become more of an energy war as time goes on. I think that's largely a function of the fact that Russia is essentially an energy superpower, right? It is has the world's biggest reserves of gas. It's the world's second largest oil exporter. It's big on a whole load of other energy things like LNG and coal and stuff like that. So if you want to hurt Russia, it becomes an energy war in a sense. Yeah. So I think it has. I think objectively also this year we've seen quite an escalation from the one side on Ukrainian drone attacks on oil refineries, which by, Reuters reporting a couple of months back put that at 17% of Russian oil refineries had been the capacity of Russian oil refinery. The headline figure, 17% knocked out. That's a pretty big thing. And from the other side, Russia is also hitting the heating, electricity bits of Ukraine, their infrastructure. So I think it has become more of an energy war. That's not to take away from the tragedy of a war that is the most deadly since World War II, the deadliest in Europe since World War II.
Yeah, Guy, you mentioned there Russia's reliance on oil and gas, but maybe set the stage for us in terms of how important is oil and gas to the Russian economy?
The famous phrase that the Americans disparagingly used to use about Russia was that it was a gas station with nukes, essentially, right? Now, there's some truth to that. There's some pain with that, but oil and gas for Russia is incredibly important. It creates a lot of money, and a lot of money that goes through a lot of different veins and arteries through the Russian economy. It's actually kind of difficult to work out how important it is. I mean, the Russian government says that around 25%, maybe 23% of the budget is dependent on oil and gas. Other figures will put that at more, and it depends on how you count it. What's pretty clear is that oil and gas is a very big part of what certainly modern Russia, but also the Soviet Union was. And it creates a lot of money for Russia and a lot of cash flow as well, and a lot of power on global energy markets, right? So it is very important for Russia. And actually, it's pretty important for the world as well, right? To have those oil flows hitting global markets. And that's part of the sort of tension that this war has created, is that people want to hurt Russia, but they don't want gas prices to go up really high.
It sort of feels like, Dmitry, no matter what way the sanctions are designed, they can be avoided. Like, have they really packed much of a punch from a Russian perspective?
They have. Russia has lost a lot of money on trying to find new customers and new routes for its oil and gas. It lost tens of billions of dollars of investment in Europe. That's a big impact, including the pipelines that were delivering oil and gas to Europe. And it had to find a lot of financial resource to create new supply routes in China and India. Did the sanction lead to a situation when flows were suspended? No. They haven't, and I don't think we will see it anytime soon, because, I mean, as in the case of Iran, I mean, oil will find the end customer as long as it gets a serious discount.
But you mean in terms of and sort of the various methods that Russia has used to find new customers? So it's whether it's rerouting through third countries or doing ship-to-ship transfers at sea with the shadow fleet, that all costs money. It's a more expensive way of earning revenue.
Yeah, it is a more expensive way of earning revenue for sure. And Russia is collecting much less money on a dollar per barrel basis than your regular producer in the North Sea or Africa or the United States.
Guy, President Trump has recently put sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil, Russia's two biggest oil companies. How painful will that be for Russia?
Well, it's certainly a big step, a really big step. Essentially, the United States have put sanctions on, and Indian refineries are saying that they're going to take less Russian crude. So that means at the end of the day that Russian oil companies are going to be earning less money, and Russian crude will have to be discounted when they sell it.
So in terms of the sanctions that we've seen so far, this is a significant tick up.
It's a really significant tick up, because for essentially during this whole war, what the West's been trying to do is punish Russia without sending oil prices going through the roof. This is a big, big step where they're really sort of the announcement, the headline, if you want, like, is we're going after your oil. And even though the particular, the today move or tomorrow move may not have massive impact, although oil has risen 5%, the sort of intent is really big. They're saying we're going after your oil.
And in terms of Russian public finances, what's the impact there?
So the impact immediately is not that great. I mean, Russian oil and energy is about 25% directly of the budget. But the way that taxation works in Russia takes the tax based on the production at the oil field. So Russia's still going to be producing all this oil. It's just going to be selling it at a bigger discount, so cheaper, which means that the oil companies are going to be getting less money.
And it's similar too, isn't it, with the Ukrainian attacks on Russian oil refineries? Same principle, that the output is still flowing. It's just that the ability to refine it and therefore export products at a higher value is hit.
Exactly. That's exactly what it is. I mean, the other thing that is quite serious is that the Indian move in some ways is more impactful. So, and you could cast the Indian move of not buying as much Russian oil as being a part of an impact of the sanctions. But Russia essentially sells oil to three main customers. That's China, India, and Turkey. So if one of those customers is moving away, that is worrying for Russia, even if the immediate impact in the money terms is not really that great.
How good is your knowledge of global energy flows? Let's test them in a quiz. As you heard Guy mention, the three biggest buyers of Russian oil right now are China, India, and Turkey. But who were the biggest buyers in 2021, the year before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine? We'll have the answer for you at the end of the show. Up next, the hit to the Russian economy from those Ukrainian drone attacks, and the crucial role of China in what happens next. Guy, Russian spending on defence meant the economy was going gangbusters in 2023 and 2024. But that's not the case this year. The financial strains are showing.
Well, I mean, the economy is slowing down and slowing down quite sharply.
Mm-hmm.
The truth is that a lot of people, after the outbreak of war, predicted that the Russian economy would collapse and it would be really bad. It would be like a massive crisis. That just didn't happen. There was 1.4% decline in 2022, and then 4+% for 2023, 2024. So that's way faster than G7. And this year they're looking at 1% growth. The IMF reckons 0.6%. What's clear, if you sort of can munch those statistics, is that it's a big slowdown, right?
Yeah.
And there's several reasons for that. One of them is sanctions, one of them very high interest rates. And the big picture overall with the economy is you have a vast amount of money and effort and management expertise going into a war economy. This isn't an economy, a normal economy, right? This is a war economy, and spending on defense and security is higher than at any point since the depths of the Cold War.
And then on top of that, we've had, since August, in recent months, a real step up in Ukrainian attacks on Russian energy sites, so like long-range drone attacks. What impact has that had on Russia's energy sector?
Yeah, it has had a tremendous impact, and it's not a coincidence that President Zelensky said that drones, in his view, are the most efficient sanctions on the Russian economy, because he can hurt the Russian energy from within. If you cannot refine the desired amount of oil, you need to export more oil. Demand for Russian export barrel is not that big. So the idea that Russia will increase, it just doesn't work, because China, India, and Turkey may not want to take more Russian oil. On top of that, refining doesn't work. So in that respect, it has been a very efficient measure that Kiev has deployed during the war. Russia has retaliated in kind by destroying big chunks of the Ukrainian energy industry. So the gas production no longer works, compressor station no longer works, and the winter looks very bleak for Ukraine. So yeah, I mean, that's what's happening on both sides. There is an immense destruction going on.
In terms of that refining capacity, that's important, isn't it? Because if you can't refine the oil in Russia, if you're just exporting crude oil, it's a less lucrative product, right? You earn more margin when you refine the product, right?
It depends on the market situation. Sometimes your margin on oil can be higher than your margin on product. But what Guy said about the Russian economy slowing, we can see this in the Russian oil industry as well. The Russian oil industry has struggled to increase production, even though the latest agreements with OPEC kind of encourage Moscow to pump more. And we've seen that this is not happening.
And then you see a ripple effect as well. We've had this month, Chevron and Shell, actually, it was stopping production of oil output from a site in Kazakhstan, because they normally send that oil to Russia to be refined. And that's no longer possible right now. So you're seeing a ripple effect beyond Russia.
This is where it gets very complex and interesting. So the oil industry is very interconnected. So you have nearly 1.5% of global oil produced in Kazakhstan by US oil majors such as Exxon and Chevron, and Western majors like European majors, BP and Shell and Eni and Total. And they are at the mercy of Moscow, because all their pipeline cross Russia, and at any time Moscow can switch off the pipeline and say, we're no longer taking crude. Russia has averted this has refrained from using this nuclear option so far, even though it can do it very, very easily. Because then if you take out 1.5% of global supply, prices do rally, and then you go into a direct clash with Washington and US oil companies. So that scenario has not yet played out. But you have certain kind of episodes which remind the entire global market that the industry is extremely interconnected.
And Guy, within Russia, the impact of these Ukrainian attacks, refining capacity is one thing. We've also seen impacts on the ground for ordinary people. There's been rationing, price increases because of these attacks. Is that right?
I mean, we also got to understand we're in an information war, right? So any attacks on the refining capacity of Russia is presented as sort of Russia is about to collapse. I don't think that's quite accurate, because when you have that amount of attacks, obviously it creates problems. But ultimately, the oil is still being extracted and Russia is taking tax from the extraction of the oil, right? So the extraction tax is still going on, whether you refine it or don't refine it.
Right.
Of course, there are loads of caveats that there have been some peripheral problems with gasoline. It's not like the whole world can't get gasoline. Outside here, you can buy, people are driving their cars. I think it was more to do with the fact that interest rates also hit at the same time, so that a lot of retailers of gasoline didn't buy large amounts of gasoline in the surplus years of the winter. And therefore, they were in a really bad position when the refineries were knocked out. So it was a combination of factors. Of course, there have been some impacts, although I think they've been slightly overdone in the West.
Okay.
Because actually the impacts aren't that great. I think what the bigger impact to me, if I could, is to go back to just this idea of Russia and the energy sector in the global context. I mean, one of the main reasons that Russia built these pipelines that go to Europe is because Russia couldn't they wanted to bind, first of all, the Soviet Union and Europe together, but also Russia didn't have the quality pipes to actually build them. And so they got Germany to help supply the pipes so that they could actually pump it westwards. And so Russia has always needed Western technology. Now that's changing slightly, and Russia is now needing Chinese technology to pump some of their oil. So it's a very interesting integration or reintegration of Russia or reorientation of Russia away from Europe to China.
That's an interesting point. So when it comes to, say, fixing the refineries that have been hit in these strikes, will Russia need to import some of the materials, the technology? Where will they get it from China?
There's a few places you can get these things. Yeah, you basically, as far as Dima knows better than me, but when you're refining oil, you're basically boiling it up. Yeah, you're distilling it in a sense. When you're making these products, there's a few places you can get that stuff. Basically, the United States, Europe, and China.
Right, and the United States and Europe.
And you ain't going to be buying them from the United States, exactly.
Right, so it's going to be China.
Yeah, or you can fix them yourself. You can do a DIY job.
Okay,
but that's
not me
really
personally,
hard.
But
It has to be China. It has to be China. And if all of this was happening 25, 30 years ago, there would be no way Russia could have muddled through those drone attacks on the refinery. The refining equipment, even today's refining equipment in Russia, is predominantly Western and was supplied by big Western producers. Now, but the technological gap that existed between the West and China has completely narrowed in the past 30 years. So there's nothing that China cannot supply these days to Russia, practically nothing. This is where Russia got fortunate probably by building this alliance with China and being able to get all this material that were previously supplied uniquely by the West. And just generally, people say that the role of China in this conflict will be crucial. And we've seen this back during the first presidency of Donald Trump. We've seen that actually China did play ball with the United States and has stopped buying Iranian oil completely at some point because they were in the middle of difficult tariff talks. And because talks fell apart, nothing has been achieved. China resumed buying Iranian oil and is buying today a lot, 2 million barrels per day, 2% of global oil output coming from Iran is being refined in China. And it's sending signals that unless the tariff dispute and the supply chain dispute with the United States is somehow addressed, it sees no reason to play ball on any of this front, be it Iranian, Venezuelan, on Russian oil. So China was pretty upset by the way the talks with the United States have unfolded. So its role will be crucial in all this.
if you're enjoying hearing about the intricacies of the energy markets, you should check out Power Up, a Reuters newsletter that tells you everything you need to know about the global energy industry. It's sent to your inbox twice a week. We've put a sign-up link in the description of today's show. You can also find it by going to the Reuters app, clicking on Menu and heading to Newsletters. Stay tuned for the next part of the show, where we hear about the impact on Russian workers from the economy's slowdown. I mean, Guy, it was interesting there you mentioned about the tax revenues, right? So Russia gets revenue from oil producers when they extract the oil from the ground, right? Regardless of whether it's refined. So does that mean then that these strikes on Russian refineries, they're not having that much of a fiscal impact on Russia? Like, is it still able to collect the revenues it needs from the energy sector? Or how's that looking?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the strikes are not having a massive impact fiscally. What they are having is an impact on the oil companies, right? So the oil companies are the ones who are taking the hit for this if you knock out their refinery. That, of course, will, through a couple of steps, knock on to fiscal, right? Because the oil company will therefore pay less tax.
Absolutely. You mentioned the Russian majors there. Reuters has been doing reporting on the Russian economy and the state of some of these major companies in different sectors, and it seems that companies are laying off staff or they're putting them on furlough. Right, there seems to be the kind of the economic strains are trickling down to the workforces.
This is a really serious situation in the Russian economy. I mean, there are very few economies that have got interest rates in the double digits. At the top of the double digits, these are serious interest rates. It's very difficult to borrow money, really. The other point about interest rates is actually the interest rates don't have a great deal of impact on the whole section of the economy that's war related, right? Because the government will still be spending no matter if the interest rate is 120%, right? So if you raise interest rates because you want to sort of reduce the flow of money, that's not going to work in that sector. So when you come to the big industrial giants, and some of these companies are very, very big, yeah, they employ people in towns and cities where often they are the only employer. So they are finding things difficult, and that's railways. We're talking about coal. Certainly, there's a lot of trouble in the coal industry, metals as well,
right?
But also some other industries, smaller industries. And so what they've been doing is putting people onto basically 4-day weeks. It's a silent furlough because they don't want to sack people. Sacking people is kind of politically unpopular. The Kremlin would say, "What the hell are you doing?" if they were doing that. But they're getting squeezed from the other side on their exports. So that's the way that they're trying to square their circle, which is to say, well, you work 4 days a week instead of 5. Of course, if you're a worker, that's 20% cut to your wage, right? They're not too happy about that, right?
What is the Kremlin saying about the state of the Russian economy? When you ask them about how things are doing.
So it's really interesting. I mean, immediately after the start of the war, right, a lot of Western economists said, "Oh, the economy is collapsing. Putin will be out of a job in a couple of months, and everything will be just a crisis." That turned out to be completely incorrect, actually, and the economy did pretty well, considering the amount of sanctions. And we're talking somewhere in the region of around, I think, more than 25,000 sanctions. So it's by far the most sanctioned major economy ever. Then I think the sort of Kremlin got a little bit ahead of itself and thought, "Oh, we're kind of invincible, right? We can do anything we want and we're not going to be affected like that." But by this, that was wrong as well. So the sort of perceptions on both sides were kind of wrong. And now I think the economy is quite seriously slowing. I mean, the Kremlin and Putin have argued that they're doing it purposely, that they need to slow it because of inflation. I think that's a difficult argument to sustain in essentially what has become a war of attrition, where a large part of whether you win or lose the war is based on your economy. And there are grave issues with exports, with payments, with sanctions, right? Although Russia's been pretty ingenious at getting around them. So that's what the Kremlin says. Although I think under the surface, a lot of businessmen and some officials are quite worried about, where does this lead in a couple of years' time? Are we entering a period of stagnation? Or is this kind of a blip and we can bring it around next year? I think that's kind of the key question as you end the year.
I suppose the big question, Guy, is can the Russian economy withstand the pressure?
So I think the question's a great question. I actually think it's the wrong question, though.
Okay.
It's not about the Russian economy at the end of the day, right? To an extent it is, of course. To an extent it's not. And, somebody said to me the other day, if Putin has the choice between the economy and the war is going to be the one that he chooses, right? So the war trumps the economy. And no matter how bad it gets, the war will be the priority. Now, of course, the economic weakness or relative weakness can play into scenarios and thinking about the future. But ultimately, I don't think that the economy is going to decide whether Putin does A or B, right? He will essentially think that Russia can take the pain. And I suppose the history of Russia in the 20th century indicates that there's a lot of potential that Russians have taken the pain in the past. I suppose one of the good questions is, would they take the pain? Yeah, is he correct in that analysis? And I think that's a less clear one for me.
If you want to keep up to date with what's happening with the global economy, why not subscribe to my newsletter, Reuters Econ World? It goes out once a week with a look at what's happening around the world. We've put a sign-up link in the show description. You can also find it on the Reuters app. Just go to menu and find it under newsletters. In the final part of the show, we look at who the winners and losers are from the energy war. Dmitry, it is remarkable, given what's going on in Russia, this major oil producer, that we haven't really seen that much of a price impact from what's happening.
It is absolutely remarkable, and the only reason behind it is called U.S. shale oil and gas boom.
Explain that. Yeah, explain that. What's the connection there?
So the connection is very simple. I mean, 20 years ago, the United States was the biggest consumer and the biggest importer of energy in the world, and it was covering with its own domestic production only 25% of what the country required. And today, they're covering 100% of what they require, and even exporting some of oil and gas to the world. And the United States has saved Europe from a very deep crisis, during the winter of 2022 and 2023 by supplying immense amount of liquefied gas to the continent.
They've made a nice profit as well, right? It's not been all.
They've made a very nice profit, and this profit will only rise. This profit will only increase because it's clear. I mean, it's clear what strategy the United States has taken. Pump out as much oil and gas as quickly as possible before all these reserves become stranded by an inevitable energy transition. And here is an interesting dilemma for Europe. Because Europe used to rely on Russia for 40% of its gas supply and for 30% of its oil supply. And it turned out to be a mistake, a complete mistake. And Europe at some point ended up a hostage of the situation. Now, today, the United States is supplying 50% of Europe's LNG, liquefied gas, and will probably supply 75% next winter, 75%. Now, regardless of the current and imminent relationship between Europe and the United States, no one wants to rely on anyone for 75% on anything.
Yeah. So they kind of swapped from one dependency to another, right?
Absolutely. Whatever that is, 75% is this too much, regardless of whether you are friendly, less friendly, etc. So Europe has a big dilemma here. I mean, not only it lost completely its competitiveness after losing access to cheap Russian energy, has become extremely reliant on the United States. So Europe is in deep crisis here. It needs to figure something out. The answer is obvious, but it's not obvious. It's to develop wind, solar, and nuclear. But how to do this in an efficient way without employing too many state subsidies, it's a big question, and no one has got a clear answer at the moment yet.
They could buy some of the equipment pretty cheaply from China, but I don't think they want to do that, right?
Well, exactly. That will increase the dependency on China. Absolutely true. And we've seen, I mean, the story of the past couple of months was the supply chain argument between the United States and China, which when each party is telling each other, well, when we will stop you, then we will stop you supplying this. And the other side says, oh, then we will retaliate by stopping you supplying with this. And it does seem like there is no end, especially with rare earth material and all of the equipment and chip. And it's just like the interdependency is huge, but everyone is using it as a weapon against each other.
China's also a big risk factor for Russia, though, isn't it, Guy, in the sense that they're obviously becoming increasingly reliant on China as a big customer for oil and gas. But China is, far ahead than others in terms of the energy transition. That is a risk factor for Russia, right?
It's definitely a risk factor for Russia. And to be honest, one of the most interesting speeches I heard this year was from Igor Sechin. He's one of the most powerful people in the oil sector. He's the head of Rosneft, which is Russia's biggest oil company. And he basically said, hold on a second, guys, you've got to take into account the fact that China could be actually exporting energy within the foreseeable future. And to Dima's point about, the rise of China and its diversification of its energy sources, obviously, if you look down the line, there's a risk there if China doesn't need to import all of that gas and oil from Russia. At the moment, it certainly does, and it is. And they've got plans to obviously export more. They've got plans for this, an additional gas pipeline. It's Power of Siberia 2. They've got a lot of great plans, but there is a risk there.
What is the end game for the energy sector here? If and when this conflict ends, is there, will the Russian pipelines be switched back on, the gas pipelines to Europe, or have things changed forever?
Yeah, it does look like things have changed forever and the pipelines are not being switched back. Maybe a sporadic deal here and there. But the way things look at the moment, again, with Trump, it's impossible to predict. But the way things look at the moment is that the US will be the biggest winner by supplying more oil and gas to the world. China will be a significant winner by buying discounted amount of Russian energy. Europe is a huge loser in terms of competitiveness as long as Europe doesn't speed up energy transition and stop relying on any sorts of imports and try to produce more energy domestically. And Russia, yes, reputationally, huge damage, no way of switching back the pipelines. Reroute, maybe finding new customers in Asia, maybe finding new routes to grow business. But yeah, from the point of view of reputation and even volumetrically, there's a big loss there. And the fifth quiet winner is the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates. People view Qatar as the most reliable and neutral supplier these days because they don't make any noise, they just ship cargoes. So it's just, this is how counterintuitive sort of the perception in the energy market has become because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
And Guy, for Russia, when and if this conflict ends, the Russian economy, does it go back to its pre-war economy basis, or is it forever changed?
Oh, I think it could flip out of that pretty fast. I think to a large extent the answer depends on how the war ends. So there's some thinking that perhaps it will be helpful to certain people in both the West and for Russia to have a kind of like mini Cold War, right? So that you have a sort of period of extended hostility where either side looks at the other and says, oh, they're terrible enemies, we've got to rearm, right? Because that's in the economic interests of certain people on both sides. There are other people who say, actually, no. If this was settled once and for all, that actually they could start to build a much different economy. Of course, I think in the broader perspective, if you think back to kind of 1989, 1991, there was a great hope that Russia would turn into a liberal kind of free market economy integrated into the West. I think that's clear that the integration into the West is really something that is unlikely to happen in the foreseeable future. And to Dima's point, and I agree with him a lot, and I fly on these planes back and forth through the Middle East, the economic relations with the Middle East, with Africa, with Asia have really, grown and strengthened over this period between Russia and those countries. And I think that is probably likely to endure. I think there will be some economic relations and some of the oil companies may come back, of course, to Russia. But I think that the trust really has been very, very badly damaged. So I think we're talking about sort of decades before that trust would be restored, if ever.
Dmitry and Guy, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Carmel.
A big thank you to Guy and Dmitry for their time and insights. You can catch their great work on Reuters.com and the Reuters app. As for that quiz, we asked you who were the biggest buyers of Russian oil before Moscow's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And the answer is China, the Netherlands, which is a hub for European oil, and Germany. This is Reuters Econ World. Every week we go deep on the economic principles and ideas driving the biggest news around the world. If you want to tell us what you thought of this week's show, please drop us a line in the comments section of your favourite podcast platform. You can also reach out to me on LinkedIn. Christopher Woljasper was the producer on this week's show. Sound design, music composition and engineering on this episode was by Josh Summer. Our podcast team includes Kim Vanell, Tara Oakes, Gail Issa, Jonah Green, David Spencer, Abisoya DeLucy, Evan Jacobi, Alex Summer, Sean Gaskell, Sebastian Summer and Sharon Reich-Garson. Our executive producer is Leela de Kretzer. Remember, for all your daily news, check out our show Reuters World News. You can catch it on the Reuters app or wherever you listen to your podcast.